When you follow Jesus Christ, life is full of surprises. And one of the greatest surprises that I've experienced in my life took place about 3 years ago. My sister called me and said, "Sammy, I just received a communication from a man in Portugal who says that he has evidence that he's our brother." I said, "What? What are you talking about?" You know, most people, when they find their long-lost brother, they find him in Dallas or Houston or Chicago or somewhere like that. Mine's in Portugal. And I said, "What are you talking about?" Well, I researched this man on the internet to find out if this was some kind of scam, and I discovered that the USA Today had a feature story on the internet about DNA testing, and it talked about this man finding his biological father. And also the Christian Science Monitor and many other newspapers around the world had an article about DNA testing and that this man had found his father. And I realized they were talking about my father. Well, I contacted the man and we got into a lot of discussions about this and whether it was true or real, and we finally submitted to DNA testing. And after the DNA testing, we discovered that he was not my brother. Well, this threw open a whole can of worms, so to speak. I had to find out who I was. You see, my father became very ill when I was just a young boy. He grew up in the pine forest of southwest Louisiana, and I grew up in the city in Baton Rouge. And because he was ill, I really didn't go out to visit his family and get to know his family. In fact, my grandparents had died before I was ever born, so I didn't know my grandparents. I didn't know who my people were. And I discovered that they came from this multiracial background. They were many times called derogatorily. It was a terrible name that people used, called red bones, as they would call them that. And it was a slang term that was used because of their triracial mixture. And they came from Native American background and African American background and English background. And so I discovered this about them. But the greatest thing that I discovered was this. My grandmother, the only thing written about her was about her prayer life. She was this godly, praying woman. I found a poem that my aunt had written. When my aunt was just a little girl, she was working in the barn, and she heard my grandmother talking to someone about things that were so intimate she ought not be telling anyone about those things. And she peeked around the barn door, and she looked, and she saw my grandmother on her knees under a tree, praying and talking to God. Well, that touched my heart, because you see, for the past 20 years, I've gone to a place under the trees to seek the face of God during my quiet time. I never knew my grandparents, and I discovered that they were these godly people who loved Jesus Christ. You see, I grew up in a home where I never went to church. My parents never went to church. In fact, when I became a Christian, my mother said, "If you're going to follow Jesus, you can't live here." And it was just a very tough time for me. 20 years later, my mother came to Christ, and it was a wonderful thing. But I discovered this one thing, that God had worked in all of these years. Eventually, my father came to Christ, I came to Christ, my whole family came to Christ, and I'm convinced of this. It was because of my grandmother's prayers. And I began to think about that. My grandmother died 5 years before I was born. My father didn't live for the Lord. He had walked away from God during World War II, and I grew up in a home that there was no Christianity. But my grandmother prayed, and I wondered, what was she thinking on her deathbed when she died? And I realized this. She died not having seen, but having believed. She prayed for my father. And 25 years after she died, my father came to Christ as a result of 2 years earlier, me coming to Christ. She prayed, and a grandson she never met came to Christ. And I'm convinced of this. All those years of ministry that I've had, going to over 80 nations preaching the gospel, is a result of my grandmother praying. I've preached to thousands of people, and I believe it's an outgrowth of this little woman in the woods of southwest Louisiana who sought the face of God. What I want to say to you today is, if you will pray, I wonder how many generations will be impacted. There's no limit to the power of one praying person. My grandmother prayed, and it impacted me, and it's impacted over 80 nations. Would you pray and let God use you?